A young, hungry boy walks into a luxurious restaurant, desperate for food, only to be thrown out with cruel, prejudiced words. But here's the twist: just moments earlier, that same boy had risked his life to save the owner's daughter from a speeding car. What happens next will shatter assumptions, challenge beliefs, and leave you questioning how often we judge without knowing the full story. Stay with us as we unravel this powerful tale of redemption, courage, and the unexpected ways kindness can transform lives. You won't want to miss a second of this journey. Nathan's small, bare feet carried him through the bustling streets of central London, his eyes scanning for hope amidst the towering buildings. Hunger gnawed at him like an old enemy, relentless and familiar. When he stopped in front of an elegant restaurant with golden signage and gleaming windows, the aroma of roasted meats and fresh bread filled his senses. Summoning courage that only desperation can muster, he stepped inside. But before he could utter a word, Mr. Henry, the owner, intercepted him with a glare sharp enough to cut glass. "This isn't a place for beggars," he snapped, his voice dripping with disdain. Nathan's timid request for food was met with a humiliating dismissal as patrons turned their heads away, pretending not to notice. The world can be cruel to those who seem out of place, can't it? Nathan's experience mirrors the silent struggles of many who are judged before they're even understood. It's like walking into a room where everyone has already decided you don't belong, even though they know nothing about your story. Mr. Henry's cold rejection wasn't just a denial of food, it was a denial of humanity. Nathan left the restaurant with his head bowed, his heart heavy with shame. Yet life has a strange way of weaving lessons into its harshest moments. As Nathan sat on the sidewalk outside, trying to swallow his tears, he couldn't have known how fate had already intertwined his life with Mr. Henry's in an extraordinary way. Sometimes we encounter people who treat us poorly without realizing the gifts we've brought into their lives. And sometimes those same people are forced to confront their own flaws in ways they never expected. But that's a story for the next chapter, one that begins not in a restaurant, but on a busy street corner where courage meets destiny. The streets were alive with the chaos of a busy afternoon, but Nathan's sharp eyes caught something that froze him in his tracks. A little girl, no older than 7, was being dragged toward the road by an overexcited dog. Her tiny frame seemed helpless against the animal's strength, and the screech of an approaching car painted a horrifying picture. Without a second thought, Nathan dropped his tattered bag and sprinted toward her. Time seemed too slow as he reached her just in time, pushing her out of harm's way. The car sped past, missing them by inches, leaving behind a gust of wind and a shaken silence. Life has a way of testing us in moments we least expect. Nathan didn't pause to weigh the risks or consider his own safety. He simply acted. Isn't it remarkable how some people, even without resources or privilege, possess an innate courage that defies logic? The girl, trembling and teary-eyed, looked up at Nathan with gratitude etched into her innocent face. "Thank you," she whispered between sobs, her voice barely audible over the pounding of their hearts. Before Nathan could respond, a well-dressed nanny appeared, scooping the child into her arms and whisking her away without so much as a glance at him. As Nathan stood there, catching his breath and nursing what felt like a sprain in his arm, he couldn't help but feel the sting of being invisible. It's funny how life works. Sometimes you save someone's world only to be forgotten in the blink of an eye. Yet Nathan didn't dwell on it. He had no time to. Hunger clawed at him like an unrelenting beast, driving him forward in search of food. Little did he know that the girl he had just saved would soon become the bridge between his despair and an unexpected twist of fate. With his arm aching and his stomach twisting in hunger, Nathan made his way to the restaurant, unaware of the storm awaiting him inside. The golden sign above the door seemed to promise warmth and comfort, but what greeted him was far from it. As he stepped inside, the polished floors and murmuring patrons made him feel smaller than ever. Before he could even speak, Mr. Henry spotted him from across the room. His face hardened, and his voice cut through the air like a whip. "This isn't a place for people like you. Leave." The words stung more than any physical blow could have. Rejection has a way of amplifying our deepest insecurities, doesn't it? For Nathan, it wasn't just about being denied food, it was about being denied dignity. The humiliation burned as he turned around and walked out, his head low and his heart heavy. Outside, he sat on the cold pavement, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Tears welled up in his eyes, but he swallowed them down. Crying wouldn't fill his empty stomach. Passersby glanced at him, but kept walking, their indifference cutting deeper than Mr. Henry's words. Life often feels like a series of closed doors when you're at your lowest, doesn't it? But what we sometimes forget is that rejection can be a redirection, a painful nudge toward something greater. As Nathan sat there, unaware of what was unfolding inside the restaurant, fate was already setting the stage for an unexpected turn of events. The very man who had dismissed him so cruelly was about to learn a truth that would shake him to his core. Inside the restaurant, Mr. Henry returned to his routine, unaware of the monumental mistake he had just made. His focus shifted only when a sleek car pulled up outside, and his wife stepped out, carrying their visibly shaken daughter. Emma's terror-streaked face immediately caught his attention, and he rushed to meet them. "What happened?" he asked, his voice trembling with concern. Between sobs, Emma recounted the story of how a boy had saved her from being hit by a car. Her words hit him like a thunderclap. "He was so brave, Daddy." But he looked hurt and hungry. Isn't it strange how life has a way of humbling us when we least expect it? Mr. Henry's mind raced as guilt began to seep into his heart. The boy Emma described sounded eerily familiar, the same child he had dismissed so cruelly just moments ago. It's one thing to make a mistake unknowingly, but it's another to realize that your actions have directly harmed someone who deserved kindness instead of contempt. His wife added gravitas to the moment, explaining how the boy had walked away injured and alone. Mr. Henry's chest tightened as the weight of his prejudice became impossible to ignore. Without hesitation, he stepped outside, scanning the street for the boy he had wronged. Each step felt heavier than the last as he crossed the road and spotted Nathan sitting on the sidewalk, clutching his injured arm. Life has a way of forcing us to confront our flaws when we're ready or even when we're not. Mr. Henry hesitated for a moment, pride wrestling with guilt, but deep down, he knew what he had to do. The next chapter would be one of reckoning and redemption. Mr. Henry stood frozen for a moment, his gaze fixed on the boy sitting on the sidewalk. Nathan's small frame looked even more fragile under the weight of exhaustion and pain. His arm was cradled close to his chest, likely injured from the rescue, but it was his eyes that struck Mr. Henry, the most tired yet resilient, as if they had seen far more than a child should ever have to see. Summoning courage, Mr. Henry crossed the street, each step feeling heavier with the guilt that gnawed at him. When he finally stood before Nathan, he hesitated, unsure how to begin. "It was you, wasn't it?" he asked softly, his voice trembling. Life has a way of humbling even the proudest among us, doesn't it? For Mr. Henry, standing before Nathan was like looking into a mirror that reflected all his flaws. He saw not just a boy, but a reminder of his own shortcomings, the prejudice that had clouded his judgment, and the cruelty he had so easily dished out. Nathan looked up slowly, recognizing the man who had humiliated him earlier. His expression was guarded, a mix of sadness and distrust. After all, how do you trust someone who has already shown you their worst? Yet there was no anger in Nathan's eyes, only a quiet strength that seemed far beyond his years. Mr. Henry struggled to find the right words as he knelt to meet Nathan's gaze. "I was wrong," he admitted finally, each word heavy with sincerity. "I judged you without knowing anything about you, and I treated you unfairly." Nathan said nothing at first, but the tension in his shoulders softened slightly. Isn't it remarkable how a simple acknowledgement of wrongdoing can begin to mend even the deepest wounds? Mr. Henry's apology wasn't just for Nathan, it was for himself too, a step toward becoming the man he wanted to be. And so began a moment of reckoning that would change both their lives forever. Mr. Henry knelt on the cold pavement, his pride crumbling under the weight of his guilt. He looked Nathan in the eyes, seeing not just a boy, but a reflection of his own failings. "I was wrong," he said, his voice trembling with sincerity. "I judged you unfairly, and I treated you in a way no one deserves." Nathan blinked, taken aback by the sudden shift in tone. He had grown used to being ignored or scorned, but an apology? That was new. Still, he listened quietly, his injured arm resting on his lap as Mr. Henry's words poured out, like a dam breaking. "There's something powerful about admitting when we're wrong, isn't there? It's not easy to confront our own flaws, especially when they've hurt someone else." But in that moment, Mr. Henry wasn't just apologizing to Nathan. He was confronting the prejudices that had shaped his actions for far too long. "You saved my daughter's life," he continued, his voice thick with emotion. "And I treated you like you were invisible." Nathan's lips curled into a faint smile, his quiet forgiveness shining through his tired eyes. "It's okay," he said softly, showing a maturity that belied his years. "Forgiveness is a gift that heals both the giver and the receiver." Nathan's simple act of grace left Mr. Henry speechless, humbled by the boy's capacity for kindness despite everything he had endured. But Mr. Henry knew words alone weren't enough to right his wrongs. Actions would have to follow. He stood up and extended a hand toward Nathan. "Come with me," he said gently. "Let me make this right." And so began a journey of redemption, not just for Mr. Henry, but for everyone who had witnessed the scene unfolding on that busy street corner. As Nathan crossed the threshold of the restaurant once more, this time with Mr. Henry holding the door open for him, the air seemed to shift. The same patrons who had witnessed his earlier humiliation now watched in stunned silence as the boy was led to a table. Mr. Henry's demeanor had softened. Gone was the rigid, judgmental man who had dismissed Nathan so cruelly. "Sit here," he said gently, signaling a waiter to bring food and a first aid kit. Nathan hesitated, his hunger battling with his lingering distrust, but eventually he sat down. The warmth of the room and the smell of food were almost overwhelming. Isn't it fascinating how a single moment can unravel years of hardened beliefs? For Mr. Henry, this wasn't just about feeding a hungry boy, it was about confronting the man he had been and deciding who he wanted to become. As Nathan ate slowly, savoring every bite as if it were a rare treasure, Mr. Henry couldn't take his eyes off him. He saw not just a child, but a lesson in humility and resilience. How often do we let our assumptions blind us to someone's true worth? Nathan's quiet strength and gratitude spoke louder than any words could. The restaurant felt different now, as if kindness had seeped into its very walls. The staff moved with a newfound sense of purpose, and even the patrons seemed less aloof, their curiosity turning into quiet admiration. Mr. Henry sat across from Nathan, watching him eat, but also reflecting deeply on his own actions. "I owe you more than an apology," he said after a long pause, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I owe you a chance to heal, to grow, to dream." And with those words, the seeds of change were planted not just in Mr. Henry's heart, but in everyone who witnessed this transformation. The atmosphere inside the restaurant had shifted entirely. Patrons who had earlier turned a blind eye to Nathan's humiliation now watched in awe as Mr. Henry treated him with care and respect. Plates of warm food were brought to the table, and Nathan ate with a quiet gratitude that spoke volumes. The once aloof diners exchanged glances, some even smiling at the boy, as if collectively acknowledging the significance of what was happening. Just as the tension began to settle, the door swung open, and in walked Emma, holding her nanny's hand. Her eyes lit up when she saw Nathan, and without hesitation, she ran to him. Children have a way of cutting through societal barriers with their pure hearts, don't they? Emma threw her arms around Nathan, calling him her hero for saving her life. Her voice rang out with sincerity, and the room fell silent as everyone took in the scene. Mr. Henry's face softened further, his daughter's embrace of Nathan reinforcing the depth of his earlier mistake. The applause started slowly, but soon grew louder as the other patrons joined in, moved by the unfolding story of courage and redemption. It wasn't just about Nathan anymore, it was about what he represented: resilience, kindness, and the power to change hearts. In that moment, Mr. Henry realized that this wasn't just an apology or a kind gesture, it was a turning point. The boy he had once dismissed had not only saved his daughter, but also awakened something within him that had long been dormant: empathy. As Emma sat beside Nathan, chatting away like they were old friends, Mr. Henry stood up and addressed the room. "This boy is a hero," he said with conviction. "And today, he reminded me of what it means to be human." The applause swelled again. But this time, it wasn't just for Nathan, it was for the transformation that everyone had witnessed. The applause in the restaurant gradually faded, but the impact of what had transpired lingered in the air like an unspoken promise. Mr. Henry, still seated beside Nathan, felt a surge of determination, unlike anything he had experienced before. This wasn't just about making amends for one mistake, it was about changing the way he saw the world and his place in it. "Nathan," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion, "I want to do more than just feed you today. I want to help you build a future." The boy looked up, his eyes wide with surprise and cautious hope. It was a moment that neither of them would forget. Isn't it incredible how one act of kindness can ripple outward, affecting not just individuals but entire communities? Mr. Henry's words weren't empty promises. They were the seeds of a transformation that would soon take root. He began asking Nathan questions about his life, his struggles, his dreams, and listened intently to every word. For the first time in a long while, Nathan felt truly seen and heard. "You've taught me something important today," Mr. Henry admitted. "It's not enough to succeed in life if you fail to see the humanity in others." His words carried weight, resonating not just with Nathan, but with everyone who had witnessed the scene. That day marked the beginning of a new chapter for both Mr. Henry and Nathan. The boy who had been rejected at the door was now at the center of a heartfelt conversation about hope and change. And as Mr. Henry vowed to help Nathan rebuild his life, he also made a silent promise to himself: never again would he let prejudice cloud his judgment or prevent him from extending compassion to those in need. The restaurant was no longer just a place of business, it was becoming a beacon of empathy and second chances. True to his word, Mr. Henry didn't let his promise to Nathan fade into empty gestures. The very next day, he began taking steps to ensure the boy's life would never again be defined by hunger or rejection. He found Nathan a safe place to live, ensuring he had a roof over his head and a warm bed to sleep in. But Mr. Henry didn't stop there. He arranged for Nathan to attend school, giving him access to the education he had never dreamed of having. For Nathan, it was like stepping into a new world, one filled with possibilities he'd never imagined. Isn't it amazing how one act of kindness can set off a chain reaction of change? Nathan's transformation wasn't just about material comforts, it was about hope. Slowly but surely, the sadness that had once clouded his eyes began to lift. He started to dream again, imagining a future where he could help others just as someone had helped him. Mr. Henry, too, found himself changed in profound ways. Helping Nathan wasn't just an act of charity. It became a journey of self-discovery and redemption. He realized that wealth and success meant little if they weren't used to uplift others. As weeks turned into months, the bond between Nathan and Mr. Henry deepened. Emma treated him like an older brother, and the restaurant staff began to see him as part of their family. The boy who had once been shunned at the door was now embraced by the very community that had ignored him. But perhaps the most beautiful part of this story is how it reminds us that change is always possible both for those who need help and for those who offer it. The story of Nathan and Mr. Henry became more than just a tale of redemption. It grew into a living, breathing testament to the power of kindness. As Nathan settled into his new life, he never let go of the humility and courage that had defined him. He often visited the restaurant, not just for food, but to volunteer and help others who were struggling, just as he once had. Mr. Henry, now a man transformed, watched with pride as Nathan blossomed into a beacon of hope for the community. The boy who had been invisible to so many was now impossible to ignore. Isn't it extraordinary how life can turn pain into purpose? Nathan's journey reminds us that even in our darkest moments, we have the power to inspire change not just in ourselves, but in those around us. Mr. Henry's transformation was proof that empathy can be learned, even by those who have spent years blind to it. He began to see the world through new eyes, recognizing the humanity in everyone who walked through his doors. His restaurant became more than a business. It became a sanctuary for people in need, a place where no one was turned away. This story leaves us with a powerful lesson. Small acts of kindness can create ripples that change lives in ways we can't always foresee. Nathan didn't save Emma for recognition or reward. He did it because it was the right thing to do. And in doing so, he not only saved her life, but also redeemed a man and inspired an entire community. The story of Nathan and Mr. Henry is a profound reminder of the transformative power of empathy and second chances. Nathan, a boy with nothing but his courage and a kind heart, changed not only his own life, but also the life of a man trapped in prejudice and indifference. This tale isn't just about redemption, it's about the ripple effect of small acts of kindness. Nathan didn't save Emma for recognition or reward. He acted because it was the right thing to do. And in doing so, he became the catalyst for a transformation that reached far beyond himself. Now, let me ask you, how often do we judge others without understanding their struggles? How many opportunities to show compassion do we miss because we're too quick to assume or too busy to care? This story challenges us to look inward and ask ourselves if we're living with the kind of empathy that can truly make a difference. It reminds us that no matter how small our actions may seem, they have the power to spark change in ways we can't always predict. What are your thoughts? Have you ever experienced or witnessed a moment where kindness reshaped someone's life, or even your own? Share your story in the comments. And if this tale inspired you, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss more stories like this one. Together, let's continue learning, growing, and making the world a little kinder one act at a time.